Excellent. Morning, welcome back to the second day of Applicative 2016. Before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsors. You'll see them when the presenter's slides aren't on, but our sponsors for this year's conference are Google, AppNexus, the K Family Foundation, Facebook, and Backtrace. So please, go see the AppNexus folks on 4 during the coffee break, and thank you to our sponsors for sponsoring Applicative. We start again this morning with, we single track for the first presentation. So Brad Green is about to talk about building apps on large teams, as you can see behind me. And please welcome Brad. Thank you very much.
Hi, good. I'm an Eng director at Google. I manage a couple different teams. One of them is the Angular team, and maybe some of you have used that. I want to talk today a little bit about some of my experiences of having worked at Google and how I think this idea of inclusiveness, about bringing people together in sort of empathetic ways, can be really important for building large teams. And so, my premise for this talk is that this word inclusiveness, which is kind of maybe an uncomfortable term, it has connection to feelings. And I think, though, it's really important. It's important for us to talk about these things, and it's important maybe because it is uncomfortable for us. So I'll turn up the heat just a little bit, and I'll introduce this other word, which I think is also important for getting to an inclusive organization, which is the word empathy. Now, I might just simplify empathy a little bit by saying empathy is the way that I can use my neurons to figure out what someone else is experiencing. What are they feeling? And I think it's really important to use this when things are not going well. And just to add the final brick on the fire, I'm going to say that compassion is the way that once we understand that something's going wrong and what somebody else is experiencing, this is us acting on it. This is us doing something about it to make it better. Now, to bring the temperature level down just a bit, we can relabel these things. The inclusiveness being maybe the goal for how we can all work together well. Empathy is the skill I can use to know what should happen. How do I figure out what someone else is feeling? What do they want to have that would be better? And then compassion is just me acting on that knowledge. How do I figure out what to do and then do something about it? So I'm here talking to you folks about this because we've seen the shift from people who are in charge to the actual developers on the ground. So whether you're the CIO or the developer, a lot of these technical decisions about which software architecture I pick, which frameworks and libraries and tools that I use, they've moved down to the individual developer. And I think this is right, because the technology changes quite rapidly. And the only folks who can really know what's going on and what we should pick are the people who are using the tools themselves. And so whether you're the CIO and you're being a guide and a mentor to these folks, or if you're a developer on the ground making these decisions, I hope there's something here for you folks. A little bit of background on myself. I started at Google over 9 years ago, and I've had the opportunity to work on a bunch of, I think, pretty interesting teams, from Gmail to Angular. There's an internal team that I manage right now called Green Tea. It's about 100 engineers, and we build the CRM system for Google. You'd think of it as Salesforce.com, but just for Google's ad sales. And then through that and through Angular, I've gotten to work with the AdWords team as well in a couple different capacities. And so I want to tell a couple stories from these environments, places I've screwed up, and things where I think things have gone well, that I hope you guys can reuse. Now, when I go through these examples, don't take them literally like I'm telling you should do exactly what I do, but hopefully as maybe illustrative guides for ways that you could apply these ideas in your own world. Start with Gmail. This is kind of where I started at Google. There was a group of products that we called apps. I think we call it Google for Work or Google Enterprise, something like that. But there was this, I was attached to the group back in 2008, where I was responsible for a team of folks that were called engineering productivity, kind of this lofty goal that nobody knows how to measure. But our job was to look at things like testing tools, process, release engineering, just all the things that would hopefully allow us to ship software faster, provide value to people quicker than we were doing before. Now, in Gmail in particular, we had a problem in that we had actually not shipped anything for 6 months because we couldn't. We didn't know how to get a stable build together that we could ship out. And so this seemed like a problem for me in charge of engineering productivity because we didn't have any. And as I probed a little bit deeper, what I found is we had built this swamp of code. And if you've done coding, you've also probably built a swamp of code. This one had been built over many years by, eventually hundreds of developers. And there, bad things that would pop out and get you and things that would drop down and bite you. And it was just not a very nice environment. Now, in particular, the thing I noticed was there were very few tests. Google has a really deep culture of testing, and at that point, we didn't. We were just starting to. But there was really nothing about the automation that could tell me that there was going to be a reliable build that we could put together. And the behavior that we saw was when somebody got a software build that was working, they would stand on their chair and say, everybody sync to CL number 32845. It's safe, and it never was. So I decided I was going to be the hero here. And I was going to use some sort of superpowers to, make those developers understand that you should write some tests and do the right thing. And, obviously they were just being bad. And so this led to a bunch of discussions with management and the individual developers. And I remember one particular discussion that I was having with the tech lead of Gmail front end at the time. And to protect his name, we'll just call him John Pirlo. And John and I were talking about tests and writing them and whether or not we should write them and the value of tests. And I think we both said some things we wish we hadn't, and it got pretty heated. And then at some point, John kind of sat back and looked a little defeated, and he just said, how? How do you expect me to write tests in this swamp that we have? And he was really reflecting to me that he also felt overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. We had built this very tightly coupled mass of stuff that you really couldn't inject unit tests in anywhere. And you couldn't put together a stable end-to-end test environment. And so I went from thinking I was going to be the hero to I am the jerk. I have been this person asking the developers, berating them to do this thing they really could not do. There was really no good way infrastructurally for them to do this thing, and no individual could go untangle the massive code that we had written. And so this experience has lasted with me, and I didn't want to feel like this character on the screen, but I think that's how they viewed me. So I thought about this. I've thought about this for many years since. And why is this so hard? How did I get from being, I'm going to solve the problem, analyzing it deeply, to just being the jerk, asking people to do stuff they can't do? And I think it's kind of about the nature of the work that we do as software engineers. In that, if I'm thinking about this path from inclusiveness through empathy to compassion, it's really the empathy step that's difficult. And as a little bit of data, there's this interesting video that I watched on YouTube where they talk about analytical versus empathetic networks in the brain. And what they show is that, hey, when you ask people to do analytical things, solve math problems, write software, those sort of things, certain parts of the brain light up. And we think those are the things that do the analytical processing. And when you ask them to do empathetic type things in the brain, when you ask them to maybe recognize expressions on people's faces and guess their emotion, then different things light up, and the analytical parts are suppressed. And so my mental model behind this is that these are kind of expensive processes, and the brain doesn't do both of them at the same time, and you can't use them together. It's a pretty good video, and I'll share my slides with you all. I'll tweet it out at the end so you can see this. It's about an hour, so we won't watch it right now. You guys can go do that later. But the way I think of this is, if I'm doing the technical work, I'm deep into the analytical side in my development. If I want to exercise my empathetic side for inclusiveness, I have to pause and do something different. I have to give myself some space away from the analysis so that I can really think about what's going wrong with the programming of humans. Like I always like to say, programming computers easy, programming humans much more difficult. this video also says some interesting things. It says, hey, if you're not good at empathetic or analytical skills, you can actually get better at both of them. And it suggests that, for empathetic, you can get better at it through meditation and yoga and other similar things. For the analytical side, actually, you can get better at it through doing a first-person shooter video game. It can be fun. And I would love to talk more about my meditation practice and the games that I like. But for me and the stories that I've got to share, a lot of them have just been about trying something, failing at it, and then trying again. And this has served me well in life. And so I'm just going to tell some stories about how I've failed and maybe how I've recovered a couple places. So back to our story about Gmail. And this is what kind of got me thinking down the path of, what if developers were given some better tools? Rather than saying, hey, here's JavaScript and some libraries and a whole 100 developers, good luck, I hope it all works out well. Maybe at the start, we could give them the pieces that they need to not have to invent everything on their own team. So if we could agree on some common ways of doing things, it could go better. And this is really how Angular started, where myself and some other folks that worked with me on Gmail thought about the problems we had experienced and said, well, maybe we could put this into a framework that gave people a leg up. And there's a couple choices that we made early on in Angular that I think really put us down the path that helped us be inclusive on the Angular project itself, and then helps developers who adopt it do inclusive things on their projects. The big ones that I want to talk today about are, number one, having some default structure, that I don't have to invent everything from raw JavaScript from the get-go. That the code that I write should not just have testing tools attached to it, but actually should be testable in and of itself. I'm actually really happy that we did Angular as an open source project from the beginning. And where it might be obvious and commonplace now, back in 2009, this was not the case. It was not a popular thing to do. People often ask me, hey, Brad, how did you get permission to open source Angular? To which I sheepishly usually reply, I was supposed to get permission? Wasn't really sure about that one. And then having some declarative way to express certain parts of your framework, things that you can put into a much more human-like language rather than imperative code. Now, back to the earlier part of the presentation, like when we're evaluating software and tools, it is important to think about our personal productivity and how the world looks to us. But I think the things that we get to do as a group are much more impactful and are maybe an even bigger part of selecting the architecture tools and libraries that we use on our framework. So with that hat on, thinking back to our Gmail days about structure, we started to think about, well, what do we want in this framework? And as opposed to saying, hey, I just wanted to be able to do JavaScript, I think is kind of a natural reaction. If I know JavaScript and I'm a front-end developer, why do I want to have the burden of having to do things your way? But I think this is actually really useful if we can all agree that, maybe I don't agree with all that stuff, but having some opinions in here that I basically agree with can be super useful. And for Angular, this meant identifying the common idioms that people are going to run across whenever you build any kind of application with a front end. Any kind of thing that deals with user events and has to draw stuff on the screen, marshal data back and forth. That we give people this idea of, I know what to expect when I encounter any Angular project. Anyone that I come across, I'm going to basically understand the shape of things. And that while it will take a little bit more time to learn all of these idioms and practices up front, overall, it really dramatically reduces the amount of time I have to spend learning because, yeah, it's more than just JavaScript, but I don't have to learn all the idioms of my sub-team and the greater teams and everywhere that I encounter this application or when I move to a new team that's not the one that I started on. And just that we have this common understanding of how we build software applications. So in particular in Angular, we express this as a bunch of different pieces. Number one, the templates that we build in HTML, the way we wire templates together with business logic for components, the way we have non-visual pieces of business logic and services, the way we transform data in pipes. In addition to all of those API sort of guides for folks, we also ship with a very nice style guide. And I say it's very nice, not that I think it's got all the right answers, but that we actually document the reasoning, the rationale behind these answers, so that you can, as your own team, decide whether or not you want to adopt them. And I think it's that's important. Not that you actually pick a particular set of guidelines, but that as a team you agree, that you've had a discussion about a bunch of the places that you're going to encounter in developing as your software grows. And that as a team you agree on what's going to go on. Now, if you're using Typescript to develop your Angular 2 application, we can actually do even better than this, because there's a very nice tool contributed by someone in the community called Codalyzer. And what it does is it does static analysis on your application and can actually tell you if you're following the best practices or not for the ones that you've decided to adopt. Now, on this topic, there are actually many different languages you can pick to build UIs on the front end of JavaScript today. You can use what's kind of classic JavaScript, ECMAScript 5, things that most people use today. You can use what is current JavaScript, what's actually in all the evergreen browsers today, ES6, with nice things like modules and classes and fat arrow functions. And you can go a little bit further and use types on top of ES6 in what we call Typescript. And I want to relate to you why I'm kind of a fan of the type version of this in the sort of transition that the Angular team made ourselves. When we started out, we were a very small team. Like, it started with one guy, and then 2 people, and then 3. And we'd come from a Java background, and a lot of us felt that, hey, typed languages mean I have to type a lot. I have to add all of the types to satisfy the compiler. But as we grew, we kind of started feeling like, well, maybe we no longer understood our code, and certainly the new people we were bringing on didn't understand the stuff we had written before, because there was no nice way for them to trace through. IDEs really couldn't help. And so as we got just a little bit bigger, we really kind of changed our thinking. Now, TypeScript is different than other type-based languages. The types are optional, and they're maybe more helpful through the type-based inferencing. But in general, we've found types super helpful as a communication mechanism with our team. So in thinking through, what do I need to use to express my intention in the code, these types have been very helpful. And if we think back to our past selves, I think we would have maybe thought about this a little bit differently, thinking about all the changes we had to make to our software, about how hard it was to understand the system we built. And so, I think it's actually not only hard to have empathy for other people, it's sometimes hard to have empathy for our future selves and about all of the work that we're gonna have to put in. So maybe thinking about this as one of the aspects when you think about inclusiveness. What am I gonna need to experience in the future? So from the get-go, we also wanted to make things testable. And so for us, this meant, to support unit tests, that we would make sure we could have a nicely decoupled system with dependency injection used as the way to wire our components together, that we would ship with a whole bunch of mocks that make setting up state for your application easy, and then we built this testing tool for unit tests called Karma, built on Node, that makes it so that I can run tons of unit tests very quickly, and that its setup was super easy. For scenario tests, we built some specific APIs to make sure that we could have stable end-to-end tests that actually tells the test when it's safe to continue, when all of the async operations is completed and the test can go to the next step. On top of this all, we built a bunch of performance benchmarking tools. And then we were really happy to see that some folks on top of this, other folks at Google, built this very nice tool called Protractor for constructing end-to-end tests. I think this is one of the nice things. When you start investing in areas that are important to other groups, you have all of a sudden an ability to attract them to your project and start some collaboration. So at Google, we have a bunch of folks in the test-specific field. And now there's a bunch of folks who don't work on Angular, who I don't manage. Julie and Mark and Sammy and all these folks, they contribute to the Angular project because we've made it easy for them and we've cared about the things that they're responsible for. Now, maybe thinking about this in a larger context, like I said, I was really happy that we did this open sourcing thing earlier on. And there's kind of 2 flavors of open source that you can do. One is, I'll just call it one way, where I release the software, I put it out there, but I don't really take contributions back. And this was kind of the policy at the time when we built software and released it at Google. We would do this very sort of one-way open sourcing. Not knowing how hard it was, we said, no, we're going to have full collaboration with the community. We're going to make it all good. It's super hard. Don't do it. But I think it has been super valuable for us in our learning about what do other people need and about learning about what does it mean to have a fully inclusive process where we can bring in people from the community and they can work on the parts of the framework that are most important to them. Really happy that at this point we've had over 1,400 folks who don't work at Google who have contributed to the Angular platform. And if you look around the world, it's grown pretty big. Like there's a ton of meetups, about 250,000 people go to meetups every month, about 600 different meetups specifically for Angular that go on around the world. And then if we look at the community size from the number of people that go to our docs every month, it's about 1.3 million folks on Angular 1, and even though we're just about to release Angular 2, already about 480,000 folks building software with it today. So nice numbers, but folks still ask me, hey, Brad, why would Google invest in this, have this giant investment in an open source project like Angular? And I'll admit that it really wasn't obvious from the beginning why I was doing this, but I just kind of wanted to. But looking backwards, I think we can claim a lot of really nice things. As it turns out, Angular was actually popular outside of Google far before it was popular inside of Google. Now about a third of the front end developers build their applications using Angular at Google. But it wasn't true at the beginning. And so we had this opportunity to work on all of the use cases, get them nailed down, actually see a much broader set of use cases than we would have otherwise just by doing it at Google. When it became popular, we were really in a really good shape because people in the community had contributed a whole bunch of tools. There were books written. You could just go to Amazon and buy a book about this thing that we never could have had if it was just an internal tool. It's also super useful in recruiting because if you already know a technology that Google uses for building software, you're going to be much more successful. We're going to want you to come and work at Google. And I actually think it's a good way to attract it. Like if you're actually like using Angular or some other technology that we open source, then maybe you're more likely to come apply. And on top of that, all of the conferences and the training and other things that come with having a big external community have been fantastic. All right. The last, and I think the biggest benefit has been moving some of what we do from this sort of imperative, specifying every line of code what the application should do, into this sort of declarative way where I just tell the system what I want. And a simple example would be if I want to center something on the screen, imperatively, I find the height and the width of the outer container, I find the height and the width of the inner thing, and I do some math and I move it around. Versus if I just have something that says center, I know CSS doesn't know about that, but if I say center, I just immediately can read it and know what the intention is. And so in Angular, we have a bunch of our concerns that are in this sort of declarative realm with our templates, of course, with dependency injection. These are annotations on my code rather than specified in the code itself. Animations, internationalization, routes, all of these good things. So then the way that this has some really nice properties in that all of those concerns now become toolable. They become things that machines can operate on your behalf. And they actually allow us to bring in other groups because of this. And I'll call these folks technical non-developers who I work with on my project. And these are folks, people in design, in test, in internationalization, people in release engineering, developer operations, that have some reason to actually need to understand what's going on in my code, but can have a really much better time if tools can help them, or if they can just read the declarative parts to understand what's going on, rather than under all of the imperative parts of my code. And just as a little deeper example we have here, here's a template from Angular 2. Where, without too much training, I can be given the lay of the land and know that, well, there's a side nav layout for my UI that has a side nav, and it's got a list, and that contains some list items with some icons, and I can see the data is this set of views that obviously I get from somewhere. And if I'm a designer, for example, I can immediately start working on this with you and actually submit parts of the code myself. So with that, and thinking about the declarative nature, I want to talk about some other places that We've had some difficulties. And this is where I get to actually use my Angular hat and green tea and AdWords and work on them all together. One of the issues that has come up a bunch as this interaction between designers or folks in the user experience profession and people who are developers, people writing the software itself. One of the problems that we had in both AdWords and green tea was that in the design function, the practice was to build these sort of static mocks where in Sketch 3 or Photoshop, we would build bits that looked like what the final product should look like. And this had a couple problems. So number one, it was missing a lot of the sort of deep feedback that we wanted to get from users. It was just hard for users to tell us, what does this mean to them? If they couldn't click on it and they couldn't see their data in it, it's really hard for them to map their own. It was missing a bunch of the sort of details of interaction. What is it like when I click on this dropdown? What does it mean when I switch these views or this overlay comes over? We were just missing those pieces. And then some of the things you can draw in Photoshop are it's just not clear how we map them to HTML and CSS. Sort of impedance mismatch. And so we decided the solution for this was to move from these static mocks into these high fidelity prototypes. Something that was gonna kind of closely match what the end application would look like, but was hopefully less expensive. Because what we had done to this point, yes, we did prototypes, but usually it was some developers would take the ideas and they'd build it in a branch of the code, and it was still hard to build, took a long time, and so by the end, we would get some user feedback, but I was so invested in it that I might fix a couple things, but I would ship it anyway, even if it was not quite the right direction. So what we wanted was a cheap way to make these prototypes in a way that we felt comfortable throwing away. And it was actually the UX designers themselves who came up with this, building on top of Angular. They built this framework called AC. And AC is this rich suite of components, excuse me, that allows me to wire a realistic-looking application together with little or no code. And so you get a whole bunch of components based on Angular's material design component suite with some wrappers that allow me to wire them together with no code. A bunch of application shells so that I can really start with an application that looks like AdWords or AdSense or Google Analytics, again, with me not having to write anything. Things like animations that are kind of pre-canned that I can sprinkle in where appropriate and just tweak their physics curves. Fake data for things like names and addresses and just things I want to populate within my application so it looks real. And then for data that's specific to my app, there's this data connector that allows me to just dump data into a Google spreadsheet, take that URL, put it into one of my template configs, and immediately have that accessible to those declarative templates. So again, without writing any code, I can put together a very realistic application. And we've built both green tea and the next version of AdWords, which is now in limited release, on this new technique where the designers, the UX folks, are building like real apps where we can actually talk about the interactions, where we can get those deep insights from the users. And it's fast enough so I can put them together without worrying about throwing it away. This is not open source. It's actually not on our roadmap, but if there's folks in the audience who would like to work with us on this, I don't think it would be too hard. We had another problem on green tea in particular, where we were, again, working with our UX folks, user experience designers. Green tea is this big app. There's 100 developers, and there's over like probably 150 views inside the application, different screens. And what we were seeing is that the UX folks would design very tailored, specific controls on each of the views that totally make sense in the sort of local maxima. But what this meant was that we were replicating a lot of those components that just differed a little bit. And so it was very slow to deliver. And when we wanted to make a global change, we had to go to hundreds of components and make that change everywhere. And so I was, not so happy with this as the manager of the project and had been asking the UX folks, so like, really, folks, couldn't you just look across the whole app and before you ask us to design something new, assess whether you could use the old thing? I just made you one of those. Please don't ask for another one. And again, I think I was kind of this guy. I was asking them to do something that was really a Herculean effort, that was not something that they could do. And I don't want to be that guy. And so we've started this new project. It's kind of in early stages where we're building this visual component catalog. And the idea is that, through static analysis, we just generate the list of where all of our components are used in all of their views. So I can see the uses across the application and all of the variants across the app. So when a designer wants to design something new, they have this nice list of, oh, hey, there's this drop-down checkbox sorter thing that maybe I could reuse it. Will it work for me? And so figure out, will it work for me? We're gonna have a UI to allow you to change its options to generate new configurations, but also understand the performance characteristics. Because if I've got a lot of them on a screen, I wanna know how long they're gonna take to render. And so that I can figure out, is it still gonna meet my latency bar? We've got a prototype of this right now. It looks horrible, but I think it's pretty useful. Where we just, by static analysis, inspect all of the inputs and outputs for components. We allow you to configure it. As you configure it, it actually generates the HTML template that I could drop into a high-fidelity mock or into the final product. And it allows me to visualize how this is gonna look at various screen constraints. This is also something that's not on our roadmap, but if folks on the outside are interested in working with us on this, I think it would not be too hard to replicate on the outside. All right. Couple ideas to wrap up. So if you accept my premise about, hey, inclusiveness is a good thing and can help your projects, then you're gonna need to take some time to pause from the analytical development track stuff that we do every day. Take some time, particularly when things are going wrong. Step back and see, could I use my other circuitry, my empathetic network in my brain, to understand what is it like to be these other folks on the other side of the wall from me. And you might be saying, hey, Brad, I got into this field because I'm kind of an introvert, and it's not really my skill set, and not for me. There's this guy on my team, Igor. And Igor, he's one of my favorite people in the world. And we hang out on weekends and do fun stuff together, but I think a lot of other folks on the team have a different experience with Igor, because he's pretty intense. And so when new people come to the team, they say, hey, Igor's this scary guy. And what most people don't know is Igor is actually, he's the second person who joined the Angular team. He's the one who is really responsible for building the open source community. He had the insight that, hey, if we're gonna be successful, we're gonna need to connect with people on the outside and have a deep relationship with them. So if you've got sort of a mental label on yourself that that's not me, well, you might think of Igor and think like maybe I'm a scary guy or scary gal, and still I could have a deep, meaningful impact on inclusiveness for my ecosystem. So you can start small. Just think about who are some groups that you work with, maybe talk with them about these ideas. If you can infect them, maybe you can talk with other folks that you work with about the same sort of things, have a more inclusive organization. I'm wearing this shirt. And rinse and repeat. So I am wearing the shirt about, you can sit with us. And my team teases me about it a lot, but I think it's really useful to have something that we can remind us about this other skill set we have, the thing that's not the analytical network on our brains, that's the empathetic network on our brains. I really believe it's important, and I kind of believe, as cheesy it is, I believe the motto. And whether you're using Angular or not, I am really interested in talking with you about these problems and hearing about how it works for you. Thanks for having me, folks. Anyone have questions? Yeah.
In my background, I've done a lot of work with combining simulations together with other simulations. It's not the syntax parts of putting things together. It's not getting the plumbing right. That's a manageable thing. It's when to use a component in the context in which it was intended to be used.
Yeah. Okay. What say more about your question, though?
So I'm asking, have you given any thought?
Yeah, okay, so I have this other thing that I didn't include in the slides, but I was kind of thinking of it. We actually built this big suite of components as part of AdWords. When they were building the next version of AdWords, they were like one of the first adopters of Angular 2, and so they couldn't use the components in Angular 1. And on Green Tea, we were excited because we had built this Angular 1 application, and we were going to move it to Angular 2. We were excited because AdWords had already built all of these components, and we were just going to reuse them. And we ran into this thing exactly what you're talking about, where yes, the components actually followed the material design spec that we had at Google, but really they were designed for AdWords and for the context that AdWords had put together. And we didn't have this problem when we had a special team in the Angular team responsible for designing a generic set of components. And I think there's nothing wrong with the folks on AdWords. They were doing exactly what they should be doing. But their empathy was aligned with the people who would consume them on AdWords, rather than the global community. And so I think when you're looking at components or software libraries or anything that's available or open source, I think you want to look for teams who are tasked with building something for a broad set of use cases. Because if I've built something for my company and hey, it works well, I want to open source it, I think it probably serves as a good example, but maybe isn't generally applicable. And I think this is what maybe you've experienced. Totally agree. I think it's possible to build components that are reusable within a very narrow set. Yeah, totally. Over here, yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of, it's really brilliant, the idea of baking in sort of these emotional intelligence, inclusive components into your framework. But I'm just wondering, if you're, and that I really want to go out and learn Angular now, but is this something that you've generalized or within Google? Because obviously we can't all be working at Google and Angular. We can't all be working in the browser development. And have you laid down or laying down sets of principles to apply that to, where you might be constrained, particularly in corporate IT, you're often very constrained. Because the principles you're talking about are broad, but sometimes you have to work in ancient archaic tool sets, and how do you apply that?
I agree. There's a lot of COBOL still out there, and it's there's reasons why it's still there. It's very hard to extract ourselves from some of the systems that we're in. I think it's certainly not always possible to pick the technology that you are working in. But I think it is probably possible to do something different that you're doing today that is more inclusive. Like the things that we're doing in moving some of what we do from imperative to declarative, I can do this in any language. And that makes it more toolable. And that allows me to include these other sets of folks. And that might be something that I would take to any environment that I was in. Yeah, over here.
Hi, my name's Lewis. I'm not a front-end person at all, so this is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
But I was looking at what you said about Typescript, and I know that some of my colleagues at Facebook have been working on a language called Flow, which, at least on the surface, seems pretty sort of trying to do the same things, adding optional type hinting, and of course we've released React.js, and I was curious what your thoughts are on how this kind of fragmentation affects the open source community and whether some of these things might be unified and standardized in the future. Thank you.
Opinions. I have lots of opinions. Yeah, I think Flow's great. I think it does about exactly what TypeScript does. I would love to see them become one thing. I think, I've talked to Anders on TypeScript a lot. I think he's in favor. I haven't talked to the Flow folks. I talked to the folks on React, but not on Flow as much. But I would love to help if I could, if there was some magical meeting I could call to make them come together. Yeah, I don't think they're too far apart. Hi.
Hi there. You mentioned the heat going up a bit when you got sort of towards the compassion piece there. I'm curious, do you get a lot of static for this approach? Can you talk more about that?
No, I think it's not static. I think it's that folks, what I've experienced is they don't want to talk about the emotional side of stuff. It's less comfortable for them. Not that people are opposed, except that they kind of shrink away from it as, oh, not my favorite topic. But if we start talking about algorithms, oh, that's an easy thing for me to approach.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, very good talk. So there are these people in the world with the initials PMP at the end of their names, and they're specifically called project managers. And a lot of times they interject themselves in morning meetings and throughout the day. And
Are
occasionally,
you a project manager?
I am not a project
Okay.
manager.
You do know developers don't show up till the afternoon meetings, right?
Well, if I don't show up at 8:30, people come after me, so I don't have much of a choice in the matter. The problem is the afternoon meetings exist also.
Yeah.
So a lot of times they interject themselves in the middle of circumstances. They're presented with complicated technical situations that they cannot grasp. Nothing to denigrate them, it's just they've got 100 of them going at them, and capturing each one is difficult. And a lot of times, the combination of the issues and the schedule kind of bollocks up relationships and make the empathetic side of this either vanish or at least not be at the forefront. Any suggestions, recommendations?
Yes. So like a lot of these ideas have come out from exactly the strife like you're talking about, where we've got folks with different mental models of the world, different abilities, yet we need to work together to build an application. The thing that's worked is uninteresting, and it's talking to each other. But in particular, actually bringing up the things that annoy you. And as an example of a conversation with designers and engineers that we had was designers or engineers would say, hey, I really wish you could just tell me what the design is once because it's really expensive for me to build it. Could you not keep iterating on that design? Please stop, you're killing me. And on the designer side, they're like, hey, it's really hard. Humans are really hard to match to figure out what kind of user interface is going to work well for them. I can't know everything at the beginning. Like, I have to iterate to figure out what is good and iterate on it in front of users. And that's how we came to the idea of doing these high-fidelity prototypes. And so I don't know what the right answer is for your folks, but I would say, like, bring up the actual problems that you see. Like, hey, you're not technical, and you're making me do things that require technical decisions. So that's not working out for me. Could we talk about what a better system would be?
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Enzo Aldaf, and for disclosure, I am also historically more of a server-side guy. I'm actually a programming language design and implementation kind of person. And in 2008, we built a language oriented to build functional reactive systems. And I was never a client-side kind of guy, like a web technology or something I didn't touch. I left it. And finally had to go into it. And I was also frustrated by the fact that basically you're forced into JavaScript and adapted our language to work on the client as well. So we're doing gradual, optional, whatever you want to call it, the data typing before you guys were thinking about it. Actually I'm not the first guy to think about that. I found about Gila Brasha talking about it in 2004.
Yep.
Although that was, I discovered that after we started doing this. Where I'm going with this introduction is given my bias and my interest. Finally, looks like the community that have power on the browsers, and you guys have a lot of power on the browsers because Chrome is big, right? Gravitating towards this new thing called WebAssembly, which opens possibilities for people like me to finally go nice, more native implementation of better programming languages in the clients. So your opinions on WebAssembly, please.
I don't have that many opinions on WebAssembly. I know very little about it. My impression is it makes Unreal Engine possible in the browser. That's what I've seen Brendan and I get up and demo. That's very exciting for me. I know it doesn't have all of the pieces we would need to implement super high-level languages like JavaScript yet. So I know that's the goal, though, that we should be able to implement whatever we want. And I love it that it will Like, the vision is really powerful, that I should be able to implement like whatever language I want and not be tied to just JavaScript. And I love a vision of the future where maybe it's more like the Microsoft Common Language Runtime, where I pick the language, I get these nice set of web APIs, and can develop against them. So it's not really opinion, but I kind of like the vision. We're certainly not there yet. It takes a long time to load. It's very expensive on the wire. But, from humble beginnings.
Programming language competition on the browser would be good.
Yeah. We've been locked into JavaScript. It has a lot of nice properties. Like, don't get me wrong. I think JavaScript, for its flexibility, has been awesome.
And Lars is awesome. Best thing to come out of Google for me is the V8 engine.
All right. Well, I'm going to have my slide deck up on Twitter. You can follow me, Bradley Green. Thank you so much for having me, and we'll see you at the conference here.